Kenya, the 1950s. A land in turmoil, a people at war for their freedom. In the dense forests of Mount Kenya, a rebel leader known as General China fights for liberation, his name whispered with both fear and hope.
I remember the damp chill of the forest at night. We were outnumbered, hunted. A British bullet was lodged in my neck, and I wondered if this was how my story would end. They thought they had stopped me, but my fight was far from over.
This is the story of Waruhiu Itote, General China, a man of war and paradox. Once a decorated soldier in the King's African Rifles, he became a mastermind of the Mau Mau revolt. To the British he was a terrorist, to many comrades a hero, to others a traitor. In this 20-minute documentary, we journey through his life of moral ambiguity, loyalty, betrayal, survival, and the making of a national memory. Waruhiu Itote was born in 1922 in Kahedi village, Nyeri district, in the highlands of British Kenya. His childhood was strict and austere. His father, a prosperous farmer, saw formal education as an excuse for laziness. Young Waruhiu received only a few years of mission school, before clashes at home drove him away. As a teenager in 1939, he fled to Nairobi to escape his father's beatings and seek a new path.
Nairobi was a shock. Bustling streets full of colonial officials and African workers, but I was just another young Kikuyu boy, trying to make a living. I toiled in factories, sold vegetables in the market, anything to survive. In December 1940, at age 18, I even married a local girl, Leah Wambura, hoping to find stability. But the world was at war, and that war would soon call me into service.
In 1942, seeking opportunity and adventure, Itote enlisted in the British Colonial Army. He joined the King's African Rifles, KR, and was shipped overseas to fight for the British Empire in World War II. He served bravely in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and in the grueling Burma campaign, rising to the rank of corporal. For a young African man, soldiering in far-off lands was an eye-opening experience. He learned discipline, guerrilla tactics, and witnessed both the horrors of war and the camaraderie of soldiers.
I wore the British uniform proudly then. In the jungles of Burma under enemy fire, we African soldiers proved our worth time and again. We fought and bled for the King. I hoped that by shedding blood for Britain, we'd earn respect and a better life back home.
But the end of Waruhiu in 1945 brought bitter disappointment. Waruhiu Itote returned to Kenya. To find a cold welcome, white ex-servicemen were rewarded with land and loans. While African veterans like him were ignored and forgotten, he passed up an offer to continue in the army, choosing instead to discharge and come home, only to face joblessness and colonial indifference. This injustice planted a seed of resentment in his heart. By 1946, Itote had joined the Kenya African Union, KAU, Kenya's leading African political party under Jomo Kenyatta, to agitate for equal rights. He also fell in with the 40 Group, a secretive Nairobi gang of disillusioned ex-soldiers known for protesting colonial rule, and occasionally for street crime to survive. The late 1940s in Kenya saw rising tensions. African calls for land and freedom grew louder, met with colonial rejection. Itote, hardened by war and frustration, became part of an underground movement preparing for armed resistance. In 1950, at age 28, Waruhiu Itote took a decisive step. He swore the secret Mau Mau oath, pledging himself to the fight against British rule. The oath was a solemn, binding ritual. Once taken, there was no turning back.
I remember kneeling as the oath was administered, the goat's blood, the sacred oaths to unity. When I rose, I was no longer merely Waruhiu Itote. I was a soldier in a new war, a war for our stolen lands and dignity. We vowed to drive out the Europeans by whatever means necessary.
Itote's dedication quickly elevated him within Mau Mau ranks. He was tasked with administering oaths to new recruits and ferreting out traitors. In those tense days, betrayal meant death, and Itote himself carried out executions of informers and turncoats to protect the movement. By 1952, the colonial government had declared a state of emergency to crush the burgeoning rebellion. Waruhiu Itote slipped into the forests of Mount Kenya with a band of fighters, transforming from an urban organizer into a guerrilla field commander. In the forest, Itote's military experience from World War II became a priceless asset. He trained young fighters in combat tactics and bushcraft, molding a ragtag group into a capable guerrilla unit. Before long, his bold strikes earned him a nom de guerre. The British codenamed him General China, reportedly because he was as elusive and unpredictable as the Chinese guerrillas the British had seen in Asia, and perhaps because of his prominent cheekbones that gave his face a Chinese cast, though the true origin of the nickname remained a secret he took to the grave.
In the Aberdare and Mount Kenya forests, I became General China. I led night raids on settler farms, quick fierce attacks to seize weapons and strike fear. We'd melt back into the forest by dawn. Each day was survival, evading patrols, scrounging for food, keeping my men's spirits high. I looked into their hungry eyes and saw hope and trust. I carried not just a rifle, but their dreams of freedom on my back.
General China's reputation spread. To the colonial authorities, he was one of the most wanted rebel leaders, second perhaps only to the famed Field Marshal Dedan Kimathi. To loyalists, Africans siding with the British, he was a figure to fear, a man who would stop at nothing to punish collaboration. But to many ordinary Africans, he was becoming a legend, the young commander who dared to take the fight to the British. His influence extended beyond the forest. Through emissaries, he coordinated with Mau Mau supporters in villages and towns, sustaining the insurgency with food, information, and recruits. After 2 hard-fought years, General China's run came to a dramatic end. On January 15, 1954, he led a daring raid on a police post at Mathira, near Nyeri. The plan was to steal guns and ammunition for the guerrilla campaign. But that night, fate turned against him. British security forces, tipped off or just lucky, ambushed the Mau Mau squad. A firefight erupted in the dark.
Gunshots shattered the silence. I felt a sudden punch to my jaw. A bullet ripped through my chin and lodged in my neck. I dropped, blood pouring warm down my chest. Around me, my men scattered. One of our stretcher bearers was shot in the head and killed instantly. In the chaos, I lost consciousness.
At dawn, British soldiers found Waruhiu Itote badly wounded and barely alive. They had captured General China, the first senior Mau Mau leader to fall into colonial hands. Photos from that day show him carried on a stretcher, a grimace of pain on his face as soldiers stand guard. The British rejoiced. The Mau Mau in the forests were dealt a heavy blow. Itote's injuries were severe. The bullet had traveled through his jaw and into his upper back. Miraculously, he survived. After emergency treatment, the British wasted no time putting General China on trial as a warning to others. In a colonial courtroom in Nyeri, Waruhiu Itote stood in the dock, guarded by armed askaris on either side. He cut a defiant figure in tattered combat clothes, a bandage on his neck, facing British justice. The charges were consorting with persons carrying firearms and possession of ammunition, grave offenses under the draconian emergency laws. The trial was swift. A prominent defense lawyer, Arkansas, Kapala, spoke on Itote's behalf, but the verdict was never in doubt. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death by hanging in March 1954. News of the verdict spread fast. The infamous General China would hang at the gallows.
When I heard death by hanging, I felt oddly calm. I was prepared to die for Uhuru, our freedom. Many had died before me. If my execution would inspire others to continue the struggle, so be it. But in the silent hours in my cell, I also thought of my young wife, of the children I hoped to have, and I wondered if there was another path.
Facing death, Waruhiu Itote made a fateful choice. In a stunning turn of events, the British offered General China a deal. His life would be spared if he cooperated with colonial authorities to help end the Mau Mau insurgency. The offer was orchestrated by the colonial intelligence chief, Ian Henderson, known as the Mau Mau Hunter. It was a chance to avoid the hangman, but at a steep price. Some would call it betrayal. After agonizing consideration, Itote accepted the offer. In exchange for a commuted sentence, death to life in prison, he agreed to use his influence to urge remaining fighters to lay down arms. the British flew the wounded General China to Nairobi, where he broadcast appeals to his former comrades, urging them to surrender. He also helped the colonial forces identify Mau Mau hideouts and strategies.
I spoke into a recorder, sending messages to the forest, telling my brothers to stop fighting, to save themselves. Each word tasted like ash. I, who had once executed traitors, was now by some definitions a traitor myself. I told myself I was saving lives, my own life and possibly the lives of others. But the truth felt heavier than the irons on my feet.
Operation Anvil Nairobi's massive 1954 counterinsurgency sweep was one campaign partly aided by Itote's information. By helping the British choke off Mau Mau supply lines and supporters in the capital, General China's cooperation dealt a significant blow to the rebellion. The violence slowly waned. From the British perspective, Waruhiu Itote had helped shorten the war. But among the Mau Mau fighters still in the field, his name became synonymous with treachery. Field Marshal Dedan Kimathi, who continued to lead the struggle in the Aberdare forest, was furious at Itote's capitulation. In a letter smuggled from the forest in 1954, Kimathi wrote scathingly of General China, "If China thinks that I will mortgage this great struggle to save his life, he must be crazy." To Kimathi and many hardcore fighters, Itote's choice was unforgivable, a betrayal of the oath and the cause. The Mau Mau slogan had been freedom or death. General China, in choosing life, seemingly broke the pact.
Betrayal. That word haunted me. I could almost hear Kimathi's voice calling me a coward. I knew some of my comrades would never forgive me. Perhaps I would never forgive myself. But I also recall the faces of villagers caught in the crossfire, the children starving in the forests. Maybe, just maybe, I thought ending the war sooner could save them from more pain. Was I a monster or a savior? History would have to judge.
Instead of the gallows, Waruhiu Itote was consigned to a remote detention camp. He spent the next 9 years in British detention, moving through a series of prisons and camps as the colonial regime tried to keep Mau Mau leaders isolated. Ultimately, he was held at Lokitong prison in the barren northern frontier, in the same compound as other top Mau Mau detainees, including Jomo Kenyatta himself. The irony was profound. General China, who had once fought against British rule, and Kenyatta, the political leader accused of instigating Mau Mau, now lived together as prisoners of the crown. In Lokitong, Waruhiu Itote reinvented himself in small but significant ways. Under Kenyatta's tutelage, he learned to speak and write in English, turning his prison time into an education. The two men, former enemies in a sense, Itote had been a militant, Kenyatta initially a more moderate nationalist, developed a mentor-student relationship. There's even an account of Itote saving Jomo Kenyatta's life in prison. When a deranged inmate attacked Kenyatta with a knife, Itote intervened and stopped the assailant. In the hardship of captivity, General China was proving his loyalty to his compatriots in a very different way.
Prison was a crucible. We were caged like animals in the desert heat. I had a lot of time to think about the things I'd done, the men I'd lost, the country I loved. Mzee Kenyatta took me under my wing. He'd call me China and teach me grammar from an old Bible. In return, I think I gave him some of my soldier's toughness. When trouble came, the day a man tried to stab Mzee, I didn't hesitate. I protected him like a brother.
Waruhiu Itote remained in detention until 1962. By then, the Mau Mau uprising had long since been crushed. Kimathi had been captured and executed in 1957, and the British were preparing to relinquish Kenya. Itote was released just a few months before Kenya gained independence on December 12, 1963. He walked out of prison into a country on the cusp of freedom, a freedom he had fought for, but one that came about through negotiations he had indirectly aided. With Kenya independent and Jomo Kenyatta now president, Waruhiu Itote faced a new chapter. Rather than returning to the forest, he was invited into the fold of nation-building. President Kenyatta brought Itote into his government, not as a politician but as a military advisor and trainer. The former guerrilla went abroad for further training, spending time in Israel to learn modern military and youth service skills. Upon his return, he was appointed Assistant Director of the National Youth Service, NYS, under the esteemed Geoffrey Griffin in 1964. For 2 decades, General China helped shape Kenya's National Youth Service, an organization tasked with youth training, discipline, and nation-building projects. It was a dramatic transformation. From forest fighter to uniformed officer of the state, Itote threw himself into the work, staying out of partisan politics and focusing on practical service. He rose to be the deputy director of NYS, serving until 1984. In those years, he kept a low profile, rarely speaking of his Mau Mau past, as the young nation tried to move beyond the bitter memories of the emergency.
I traded my rifle for a desk, my jungle boots for shiny parades. Training the youth was my new battle. We built roads, dug trenches, learned patriotism. I wanted the next generation to channel their energy into building Kenya, not tearing it down. Still, when I closed my eyes at night, I could hear the echoes of the forest, the voices of my fallen comrades. I lived with ghosts even as I marched with young men in crisp uniforms.
In 1972, however, General China's warrior spirit resurfaced in a surprising international incident. That year, Uganda's dictator Idi Amin was saber-rattling, claiming parts of Kenya's territory. As rumors of war swirled, Waruhiu Itote, then a top NYS officer, reportedly rushed with other officials to President Kenyatta's side in Nakuru. He volunteered to lead an attack on Uganda and, in his widow's recollection, even promised to bring back Amin's head as a trophy. Legend has it that Idi Amin, who had served alongside Itote in the British Army during War II, was so unnerved on hearing that General China might come for him that he quickly dropped his plans. Whether fact or folklore, the story cemented Itote's reputation as fearless. Even in his 50s, the old general's very name could thwart an enemy. In the later years of his public service, Waruhiu Itote began to process his tumultuous life in writing. In 1967, he published his autobiography, Mau Mau General, giving his first detailed account of the guerrilla war from his perspective. Later, in 1979, he followed up with Mau Mau in Action, a book delving into specific battles and strategies of the Uprising. These works were among the earliest insider memoirs of Mau Mau, providing valuable, if subjective, historical testimony.
Writing my story was harder than fighting a war. On the page, I confronted myself, the idealistic youth, the hardened fighter, the condemned man, the survivor. I recounted our victories and our mistakes. I paid tribute to Kimathi, Matenji, Mwariama, my fellow freedom fighters. I admitted where I fell short. I wanted Kenyans to know the truth of our struggle, beyond the propaganda.
By the mid-1980s, having retired from the NYS, Itote lived a quiet life. He had a farm in the Old Kalu area in Kenya's Rift Valley, where he tended to cattle and wheat. He largely stayed out of active politics, perhaps deliberately keeping a low profile as an ex-Mau Mau figure in a country then ruled by President Moi. Those who knew him in these years describe a modest, even humble man, often seen in his fields in simple clothes, far from the spotlight. Waruhiu Itote was not without family. In his final years, his third wife Margaret was by his side. His daughter, or stepdaughter Mary, also remained close. They all knew him not as General China, but as a loving, if stern, patriarch.
In the evenings, I'd sit on my porch watching the Kenya I fought for change with each sunset. I saw young people who hardly knew the name Mau Mau. I saw politicians invoke our struggle when convenient and forget us when it wasn't. I often wondered, what had all the sacrifice been for? But then I'd remind myself we did win our country's freedom. That is no small thing.
On April 30th, 1993, the news quietly reported, General China is dead. Waruhiu Itote passed away at age 71, after suffering a stroke while working on his farm near Old Kalu. It was the end of a remarkable, turbulent life. His funeral was held in a somber ceremony in Nyandarua. Under rainy skies, aging Mau Mau veterans, family, and officials gathered to lay General China to rest. Some spoke of his courage and contribution. Others avoided the controversies that lingered. In death, as in life, General China hovered somewhere between man and myth. Notably, despite his service to the nation, Waruhiu Itote did not receive a state funeral, a sign of the ambivalence Kenyan authorities felt about Mau Mau fighters even decades after independence. One veteran at the graveside remarked, China was fighting for the soil. For the black man, he commanded respect. Many felt he deserved higher honors, given his role in the freedom struggle and later contributions. Yet the controversy of his cooperation with the colonial regime still shadowed his legacy. Generations of Kenyans debated, was he a sellout who saved himself, or a pragmatic hero who lived to help build the nation? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. One powerful symbol of Itote's story emerged years later. In 1988, doctors finally removed the bullet fragment that had been stuck in his neck since that fateful night in 1954. He'd carried that physical reminder of the Forest War for 34 years. In 2010, his widow Margaret and daughter Mary donated that bullet to the National Museums of Kenya. There it lies on display today, a tiny twisted piece of metal that speaks volumes about Kenya's painful road to freedom.
They say a man dies twice, once when his heart stops and again when he is forgotten. I wonder how Kenya will remember me. As a freedom fighter, a turncoat, perhaps just a man who did what he thought was right and wrong in equal measure. I'll accept whatever judgment history passes. I have made my peace.
Today, Waruhiu Itote, General China, occupies a complicated place in Kenya's national memory. He is honored as one of the core Mau Mau leaders who fought for independence, yet his name often invites debate. In recent years, as Kenya has openly celebrated Mau Mau veterans, recognition of Itote's contributions has grown more balanced. His writings are studied for insight into the rebellion. His service in the NYS is remembered as nation-building, not treachery. Still, his life story remains a cautionary tale of the blurred line between loyalty and betrayal, and the human cost of colonialism and war. General China's journey, from a Kikuyu boy in Nyeri, to a Watu soldier, to a forest guerrilla general, to a prisoner, and finally a public servant, encapsulates the contradictions of Kenya's fight for freedom. It is the story of idealism and compromise, courage and controversy. In the end, Waruhiu Itote outlived the British Empire and saw his country free, if not always united, in how to remember its heroes. And as Kenya moves forward, his life urges us to ponder the true meaning of patriotism and the heavy burdens carried by those who secure a nation's liberty.